What I find interesting about her position is that she always insisted that the computer was just a tool for her, that it wasn't any different from a ruler or a pair of dice or a protractor. But then, in my experience, when I actually read her writing really closely, her unpublished writings, talked to her, like, sense this excitement she had, the way she would kind of come alive when she talked about these formative experiences with computers, it became clear to me that there was a lot more to it than it being just a tool, that it actually was maybe not a partner, but at least an interlocutor for her.
Hi, my name is Bryan Barcena. I'm the West Coast editor of Artforum magazine, and we are here today to talk to Zsofi Valyi-Nagy about Vera Molnar, whose work Transformation graces the cover of our May issue. And we're very pleased to be here at the Getty Research Institute. Thank you to them for being our host for this conversation, and thank you to Zsofi, and thank you to her dog, Bob Ross, who is here with us, being very nice and kind. I guess maybe we could start the conversation by discussing your history with the work or with the artist, or how you came to spend the last, I don't know how many years of your life dissecting this work and trying to get to understand it better.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, and it was just such a incredible surprise to see that her work was featured on the cover this month, and I just wish she could have seen it herself, because she would have been really ecstatic, I'm sure of that. So yeah, Vera Molnar passed away in December. She was just a month shy of 100. It was kind of classic of her to like not make it to the round number, the like zeros and ones of 100, because she was obsessed with like this idea of like 1% of randomness. And if you think about 100 minus 1 is 99, it's kind of perfect that that was the age she left us at. To answer your question, so yeah, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Molnar, and I guess I'd already been interested in just the history of artists experimenting with emerging technologies, and I came across her work in a book, then realized that her work was in a collection in Chicago, the Toma Foundation, and they actually connected me to her, which was terrifying to me because I'd never, well, I had interviewed artists before, but never somebody that had that much significance for me personally. So I cold called her on the phone at her house, and you know, she's already in her 90s, hard of hearing. We were speaking Hungarian, which is my first language, her first language. And in Hungarian, there's really complex honorifics in terms of how you address people depending on how much elder they are than you. And I think I shouted into the phone, like, how would Madame Molnar like to be addressed? You know, she's in Paris, I'm in Chicago, I'm calling her through like Google Talk on her landline. She's like, what? Please repeat the question. And finally she understood the question, and she just started cackling and was like, oh my God, I don't care about that stuff, just call me Vera. And then the work that I wrote about for this issue, Lettre de ma mère, was always my favorite work of hers. It's this exploration of her mother's handwriting, and it's probably her last foray into directly programming a computer. It hadn't been talked about as much as her really early work, because I think in the history of art and in the history of digital art, there's this obsession with firsts. Who was the first artist to work with a computer? Who was the first artist to make algorithms? And we talk less about the later stuff, or, you know, how the work was actually made and how the artist related to the technology. So I wanted to do something with that.
You know, obviously one of the reasons why this article is so urgent, and as you mentioned, is its relationship to AI, or how we think about authorship and how we think about how artists can create in relation to machines. But what I find really interesting about this work and about your approach to it is that it doesn't treat the machine like a black box, right? Mm-hmm. It treats it like something to negotiate. And I think learning to code, right, and becoming a programmer is kind of the opposite of what we think about when we think about generative art now, right? Which is that you input one thing and then there's kind of these pseudo-mystical processes that happen in the background and then emerge something that doesn't really approximate what you would make yourself, right? Which is not at all what happens with Vera Molnar's work, right?
Like, there's an element of it. I think what they have in common is the idea of randomness, which I think has been consistent throughout very early, what we now call generative art, which at the time they didn't call it that. That's a more recent term, I think, from about the last 20 years. But yeah, this idea that you can have a like more or less autonomous system that will generate images for you. I think there was an element of it at the time, but it was super rudimentary. It was, at least for Vera, it was these minor moments. Like, I think what's interesting is with the Lettre de ma mère, she has a randomness program to determine things like, you know, the frequency at which the handwriting kind of goes haywire at the end of the line. Because she's drawing these zigzag lines across the page, and then as the kind of composition, as you read it, as you would a text, it kind of goes into disorder towards the end. And all of that was determined by random numbers.
What I find really interesting about your article is the approach is quite specific in its in what you describe as media archaeology, which is about her relationship to the machine, not only as a kind of emergent object, right, in the world, but to also think of it as a tool with which one tries to extract use.
I think where what was called computer art at the time was really interested in this idea that computers could make art, and computers could be collaborators, and computers could be creative partners. The artist Manfred Mohr would refer to his computer as a partner. And Molnar was just always really resistant to that kind of discourse. She was really critical of it. This was, you know, at the time in the 1950s, they were already talking about, you know, cybernetics was really popular. Everyone was talking about the electronic brain and how computers might replace artists. I mean, now more than ever, that's actually a reality, but this was a conversation that's been a part of digital art since the very, very beginning. And I think the point in history where that really became a turning point for her was when the first computer screens became available. So this was early 1970s in France. The lab she was working at got its first CRT screen monitor. I really look at that moment as something transformative for her and something that continued to the end of her, like definitely up through the late 80s, early 90s when she's making this piece, The Letters from My Mother, where this idea of giving something to the computer and then receiving something back that's maybe different from what you expected. And this is what Vera herself called unimaginable images. This idea that there are these images that maybe you yourself can't actually visualize, but the machine visualizes them for you.
As GUIs or GUIs improved, and there was more of an ability to directly see what you were making, or that was, you know, that there were processes that were more visually oriented than they were about algorithms or code. She continued to use these earlier programming languages.
In her lifetime, she would tell me this, she learned 2 programming languages Fortran and Basic, and after that she was like, I'm done, that's enough, this was too much work, I want to focus on the images and not the like process of getting there by learning these like other languages. So I think part of it was like a practical decision of like sticking to what she knew, but I also think that there's an element there of almost not wanting to be too directly involved, not wanting to have too much control over the marks she was making. I think as much as Molnar was interested in combating this discourse about like the cybernetic brain and, you know, the computer as its own thinker, she was still interested in the notion of like the objective creative process. And so there's a way that like drawing through code gave her this kind of sweet spot of balance between control and lack of control, which maybe kind of corresponds to her interest in like order and disorder as well. And I think in so many ways, this idea of back and forth, of realizing that algorithmic art is not a linear process, but a iterative one, is something that goes all the way back to early computer art. Because there were artists that were interested in writing a system, pressing go and walking away. But for her, that's how she really set herself apart from the others. She would say, I want to intervene. I want to remain involved in the decisions, the creative decisions that are made. I want this image to be something that I created, not something that the computer created.